So here we are. We're diving into the 1990s. We've gone through the 70s, the birth of Emmanuel Community, a growth and strengthening period in the 1980s, but starting to see the signs of some
wear and tear,
some shifting sands, especially starting in the American communities, and now Emmanuel starting to face some of those issues itself. And entering into the 1990s, what was this decade really marked by as we enter this phase in your memory?
Well, certainly 1990 was marked as the launch of the Catholic Fraternity.
Okay, and what is the Catholic Fraternity?
So the Catholic Fraternity, Bishop Cordes, who was Vice President of the Council for Laity, came and visited with the leaders. Now, he was sent by Pope John Paul II to look at all the dimensions of Catholic charismatic renewal because they wanted to ensure that the charisms that had been released through the renewal were in some way supported in their life in the church. So the church was saying, how can we work with the charismatic renewal to capture this sense of the charisms for the good of the whole church? So he laid out a vision of, can you let go of IBOC to form this new reality for communities around the world? And
with a particular, sounds like the Catholic Fraternity was almost like Rome saying, we see a real opportunity to keep, I guess, new wine skins in new wine jars, new wine skins. And so like these communities are like new wine skins that the new wine can be contained and nurtured in, something that holds promise for this grace to last and not just leak out. And so Rome, the institutional church, is interested in this new emergence, but it also provided a way for the new charismatic reality to have a connection with the historical 2,000-year-old church and the seat of authority in St. Peter and all that. So the Catholic Fraternity, is that be correct? It seemed to serve two purposes. It was a way of finding, it's like, the institutional church, we're valid.
Yeah, it was a meeting because the leaders of community were looking for a more formal relationship with the church, and particularly the two key people, Brian Smith and Bobby Kavanagh from the Community of God's Delight in Dallas. So here's two key figures who worked hard to establish and are seen as the founders of the Catholic Fraternity.
Wow. But a formal recognition from the Vatican was a big deal for the charismatic renewal.
It was the first recognition.
Wow.
ICRIS, which is the International Office for Catholic Charismatic Renewal, received a canonical recognition a couple of years later.
Okay.
So, yes, it was a big step forward.
Absolutely. Wow.
So that was the start on the international level.
Yeah. And if you're listening and you're local and you're thinking, why is this important? Well, you heard Shayne mention one of those names. Brian Smith, who's the founder of Emmanuel Community, was a leading proponent, along with Bobby Kavanagh, in establishing something that was a blessing to communities all around the world. So often we're thinking, well, what's going on here in Australia? This is what matters because this is where I live. Meanwhile, it sounds like, as I hear you speak, that there was an awareness that God's doing something across the earth. He's raising up communities in South America, in Asia, in Europe, in America, and in Australia, and that's what we're part of. We're part of something bigger than ourselves. So in the 1990s, what else happened in this time? Now, we're talking about headship and submission in the 80s. We're talking about models of governance. In the 90s, the question of women in leadership and women in society, like if we look at women, the role of women in general, the 80s and 90s, how would you describe what was going on there in the world, in society, just regarding the issue of women?
It's really fascinating because I think the experience of women and women in the workforce particularly really impacted our life as a community. Let's face it, women make community. Sorry to say that, guys, but I think most guys would agree that women really know how to build relationships and hold relationships.
They're natural connectors.
Natural connectors. And when we first began, it was more unusual for women to be working. Of course, there were women working, but the majority of young mums and so forth, like when Chanel was at home as a stay-at-home mum with the kids, she always had other mums to be with. They'd share times with their kids.
It wasn't together. An isolated vocation.
Not at all. But in those ensuing years, 80s, 90s, you saw, almost this necessity for women to be in the workforce.
Mm-hmm.
So that impacted our community life significantly. And I think there were new ways of thinking about the role of women, and certainly coming out of this 1970s model of man and woman in Christ, and women subject to their husbands. And, Pope John Paul wrote an encyclical, Mulieris Dignitatem, on the dignity of women, where he taught specifically the uniqueness of the gospel is that man and woman are subject to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Wow. That almost challenged that entire teaching. Drop a bomb.
Here is an absolute bomb. And if that's not true, what else? And so you can begin to see what sort of impact that may have had on a very all-male leadership in the community, from the top right down through all the different levels.
Now, Emmanuel started to embrace women, so we started having some women elders join the leadership in Emmanuel during the 90s.
After the shedding of blood. That didn't just happen overnight.
Tell me about how much blood was shed. What?
Lots.
What? So it was a fought over issue. The fact that women were going to become elders was like, this is not scriptural or something like that.
It was a whole momentous shift, and we went through a few of them. We went through the whole shift of becoming a Catholic community, and
that happened in the 1990s too.
Yes.
So
early 1990s, it was the last act of Archbishop Rush to recognise us as a Catholic community. Different things happened. Evangelicals, Pentecostals felt like we were too Catholic as a community. The Anglicans, their bishop said to them, you need to decide whether you're Anglicans or whether you're part of the Emmanuel community.
Okay.
And so they were faced with a crisis.
Ultimatum,
yeah. So we'd been living this life for quite a long time, and the community was never less than probably 90% Catholic. And so,
right,
it was after a visit to the Emmanuel community in Paris that we just realised how much in trying to be ecumenical, we'd actually diminished our identity as Catholics.
Yeah. That's the challenge of ecumenism.
How do you... Well, the challenge of ecumenism is to be faithful to who you are and to respect the difference between
rather than water down who you are in order
to
accommodate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think we were somewhat guilty of the latter, of the watering down. And so there was a change of direction. So we went through a significant... I wouldn't call it a crisis, but it was a bit of a revolution in the life of the community. Plus, there was then challenges that emerged in the communities in the United States of what you referred to before as headship, that in fact people had intruded too far on the lives of others and were, in some cases, organising marriages.
Oh, goodness.
Which, was a bit strange. And
but how far does church leadership go? Like, do you tell someone what they should do with their finances? Do you tell them who they should date?
Well, all of that was going on.
Right.
And
so let's be real. Like the scriptures, and here's the lesson.
Yep.
Like when I read the scriptures, the Old Testament, they didn't get a rubber and a raise that King David had an affair, and they didn't get a rubber and a raise, all sorts of stuff. They left it all out there, all the dirty laundry.
Yep.
Because there's a gospel to be found in there. And to try and deny the things that you didn't do well isn't right. And it's best to just let the truth be there for all to see.
Absolutely.
And it's the humanity and the divinity at work in us and in the community. And so there was some stuff that in our name in those times left a lot of damage that needed cleaning up later, didn't there?
It's true.
So let's segue into the latter half of the 90s, which what some people will refer to as the Troubles, where Emmanuel faced its own internal crisis, a real crisis which nearly saw the collapse of the community. Yep. And this is the period where my wife and I had just turned up. gung-ho. We just came to Emmanuel and to join the Serve with Net, and we met this amazing community. But at the same time, while there's so much great things on the surface, there's also some stuff going underneath that needed to be obviously dealt with and brought into the light.
Yep.
If the community was going to go forward in the long distance. But it mustn't have been fun to be in the middle of that.
No.
And I don't know how much you want to share about it. I don't know how helpful it is to pour all your dirty laundry out there. But if someone was just brand new, Shayne, and saying, what happened? I don't even know what you're talking about. What's a helpful summary of being able to explain what happened in the Troubles?
So I think one of the things is identifying what we've seen already, what we've identified in terms, I would say three words: power, authority, and leadership. Oftentimes, and it's easier to say that looking back than it would have been in the context.
Yep.
In the context, most people would have seen it as personality conflict. And it was personality conflict, but it wasn't just for the sake of personalities being in conflict. It was about power. It was about the way authority was being exercised, and it was about different styles of leadership. So the old style of leadership with the headship and the authority and all of this was being challenged.
Right.
Women had come into the scene.
Heaven forbid.
And God bless those first women who took on roles within the community. Like, I think we should declare them saints.
Who were some of those women elders who came in that first?
So in the first group were Monica O'Shea, Hilary Scarce, and Jacinta Stewart.
I'll just honour them right now.
Absolutely.
Along with all the men who were leaders and elders at the time. But if you're a woman stepping into female leadership, and look, my wife will tell you, women leadership in the church is still a challenge.
Yeah.
But this is in the 90s where it's starting to happen in Emmanuel, coming out of a culture like we've just described for the first time.
Yeah.
And so it really was paving a new way at that time and didn't come with that cost.
Yeah, and ultimately, because there were obvious differences amongst the elders, ultimately Brian made the decision.
Okay.
And all the elders stood down and he reconstituted the eldership.
Okay.
So it was ultimately done under his authority in an attempt to bring unity.
But the division that happened in the late 90s wasn't just about the fact that there were women in leadership. It seemed to be like a perfect storm about a whole lot of different things going on. Power,
authority,
and leadership.
And leadership. Absolutely.
But they're very vague words. What was happening in Emmanuel under those banners that made...
Well, there was an attempt to reinforce the authority of leadership.
Right.
Amongst the elders first, which I think was problematic. Like when there's a suggestion that elders make an oath of obedience to the overall leader, I think we've crossed a bridge.
Right.
And most people in the community wouldn't have been aware of it.
It's almost like a superior general of an order or something like that, or a mother general of an order.
And like the hard part was we were talking about Brian, who was the founder. And no one wanted to offend the founder.
Especially since he was so lovable and charismatic.
Absolutely.
And he'd built a real relationship with his people.
Yeah.
And
the founder was seen as the anointed of God.
Right.
And so to go against the anointed of God, you risked your life and the curses of God.
And if you read the books of 1, 2 Samuel, where David, King David said, I dare not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed, even though King Saul was pursuing him to his death, that would have been, you would have put that together well with, if our founder is the one who's anointed of God, I dare not raise my hand against them because I will somehow incur the wrath of God or something, to challenge that authority. But then that leaves a wide open door for unaccountability and things like that.
And, I've got to say, I was in the midst of all of that, but you're never quite sure who's pulling which strings.
Yeah, right.
You're never quite sure where things are coming from. So, women may not have been in eldership or in eldership for long, but certainly the influence of women has been strong in the community. And, we sometimes those who were game enough to say so would say, well, the elders would make the decisions about the life of the community until they went home and told their wives. And then their wives would point out how ridiculous some of those decisions were because we didn't think of the children, we didn't think of this, we didn't think of that.
I know this conversation well. Yeah.
So it's actually very difficult to pull apart.
Right.
Because you've got the intertwining of all of those things and lots of personalities involved.
To the point where we had to, for those who don't know, the community invited in an external moderator, not the moderator as in the leader of the community, an external mediator, who's called a moderator, from the Uniting Church, I believe.
Correct.
Who had to mediate this perfect storm that was brewing. There were public meetings and all sorts of stuff. And because it was quite public, or certainly to a young person like myself coming and visiting, it scandalised many. And at that time, a lot of people who were probably peers of myself, peers of yourself, left the community after. It was like a great shedding.
Yep.
And a lot of people just found the public scandal of the whole thing just too much to handle and thought, well, if we can't trust these people we've invested so much trust in, then who can we trust? And it reminds me of that concept of idols. You know, when you put up an idol, there's only one way for it to fall, and it's down.
Yep.
And when we turn our leaders into idols, we risk they're going to be smashed.
Yeah.
One way or the other. And I feel like there's a bit of a lesson in there for us. Maybe. How would you describe it?
Oh, there's lots of lessons in that. I think for people looking on from the outside would have seen it perhaps as simply as two friends who had a disagreement.
Okay.
But it was far from that.
Okay.
It was the manifestation of all of these realities and coming in on different angles and confronting different ways in which we operated as a community. And I think it was the ultimate breakdown of the original structure.
Right. So this is a tipping point.
Yeah.
The glory days, the spirits descended, there's healings, there's miracles, there's ecumenical, there's thousands of people in the community.
Yeah.
Then there's been a stripping away, the sands are shifting, the American communities who we modelled off, they're starting to fall apart.
Yep.
What's going on over here? There's changes in society. They're saying the ecumenical dream breaks down, so we're now Catholic identity again, women in leadership models we've trusted in that aren't working anymore, and as things are getting to crunch point, and then it's almost a total collapse happens. But it's almost like a dark night of the soul for the community. It had to go through the valley of death and trust that there was light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. Well, exactly the same thing happened in the Word of God community who formed us.
Okay.
Two key figures, leadership figures, the figures that I mentioned earlier on, had this division. Now, it's not about personalities. It's about principles and practices. It's about leadership, authority, and power.
Paul and Barnabas had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company.
Yep.
So, nothing new under the sun, really.
Yep.
So we'll move through that era.
Yep.
That's the 1990s in a nutshell. Now, moving into the 2000s was where your leadership takes a new curve. Actually, just before that, when you became...
Just right on the year 2000.
Right on the year 2000. Just think of it. At the end of the 1990s, the end of the 20th century, the whole world thought that the whole world was going to maybe stop ticking. The clocks would stop ticking. And it was the beginning of a new century. So the whole world was shifting. The whole society was going, what's going to happen in the new century?
Yep.
And Emmanuel has its own journey right in the midst of that same transition. And we'll talk about that next.
Let the power